This week's topic is about grief and loss. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. Elisabeth Kubler-Ross was one of the first people to really study the process of death and dying. So a little bit about her. She was born in Europe and really fought against the things her father wanted her to do by wanting to go to medical school. So she really defied him in a time that women generally didn't do that. They sort of followed what their parents wanted. She started studying death and dying because when she was in medical school and later on in her practice and as well as when she was teaching, there was no information about it in the medical journals, other curriculum, anything like that. She had been a volunteer after World War II and had seen a Polish concentration camp, which is what may have started her interest in death and dying. Her first book on death and dying was published in 1969. And it really was the first comprehensive study of the process of death and dying. So her theories really were based on terminally ill patients and their families. So not so much people that were grieving after a loss, but people who were in the process of dying from whatever disease they might have. She also spent a lot of time working with AIDS patients and had wanted to start an AIDS hospice for children, but that did not work out. As she got more involved in the studies of death and dying, she gave up her teaching in a medical school to concentrate solely on this project. So her theories, and again, it was one of the earliest theories about death and dying, she defined the stages of grief. So they're listed there on the page for you, and I'm going to go into more detail about every one of them. It's important to know that not everybody experiences every stage, and the stages are not linear. People can jump from one to another, they can go back and forth. One of the big criticisms of her theories was that people thought that everything had to go in this order. So she did clarify that in later writing. So the first stage is denial. And this is in some ways a coping mechanism for people that are grieving, whether they're grieving the loss of someone or their own life, knowing that they're not going to live on. It's a way, too, to figure out how life's going to go on for someone who's grieving a loss or just found out they had a serious disease. People kind of get shocked when this first starts. So as that begins to fade, then the real feelings about the loss begin to surface. Think of an older person who's been married a long time and realizes they're dying, and they worry about the spouse that they're leaving behind, for example. The next stage is anger, and I think this one's pretty understandable. It's when people start to think, why did this happen to me? Or how can life be so unfair? It can be especially difficult for people of faith. Why is God putting me through this? Why didn't God protect me? Anger is okay. It's a part of healing. And sometimes we have to convince clients of that. Some clients have been taught that anger is not appropriate and they feel guilty because they're angry. But again, anger is a good coping mechanism. It is also a way for them to start to face reality. Sometimes people feel like they've been abandoned and deserted, so they get angry about that. Anger can also, believe it or not, help them reconnect with other people in their life, whether it be close family members or friends. It's just a way for them to start to make the transition in the grieving process. Bargaining, and you'll hear people say this sometimes when they're in this process of grieving. They'll try to make a deal with God. You know, I know I'm dying of lung cancer because I smoke, so if I quit smoking, I'm going to get better, right? As an example. Sometimes they'll promise all kinds of things for them to heal or to make big changes so that someone else can heal and their life can go back to normal. And then a lot of times they're questioning, what if I had done this differently? I have a client right now who's dealing with congestive heart failure, and he smoked for 48 years. He has quit smoking, but he goes back and forth sometimes about why did I wait so long to stop smoking? Did I cause this, or was I going to have this anyway? So he's kind of bargaining even after the fact that he knows he has congestive heart failure. Depression, which again makes sense. It's a very commonly accepted form of grief. And a lot of people really associate depression with grief. This really can represent the emptiness when someone realizes the person or their situation is gone and over. And sometimes in the depressive stage, people avoid others. And we know that sometimes people need to get out and talk to people, talk through their grief a little bit. So we do have to watch for people who are depressed while they're grieving to make sure that they aren't isolating. And then the last stage is acceptance. And I think we've probably all witnessed someone who's gotten to this point. Their emotions begin to stabilize. The person, if they've lost someone, realizes it's going to be okay. They're going to survive. They start to re-enter reality. And what sometimes takes adjustment is their new reality is not what it was. So that their new reality is that the person they cared about the most is gone, or that their terminal disease, they understand that they are going to die. They have good days and bad days. Again, grieving is not a linear process. So some people, they might be really good for a few weeks, and then something will come up and remind them of the person they lost, and then they'll have a couple bad days. And again, this is very normal. And at this point, too, they do start to re-engage with their friends. They start reaching out to be with people and be part of things that they had been part of before. Some common symptoms of grief, we've already talked about a few of them, but crying is pretty normal. We see that a lot. Sometimes people have a hard time sleeping, either because they're worried about their own health, or they know that they've either lost someone or they're going to be losing someone. They sometimes start to question why they're here. Again, think of an elderly person maybe who had been taking care of a spouse, and now all of a sudden that spouse is gone, and they are not sure what they're going to do with their life. People will question their spiritual beliefs. They'll start to wonder if their faith in God is misplaced, if they really need to find a different way to view God or religion. They can very often feel detached from someone else because they feel like nobody else understands what they're going through. So they tend to isolate when they're grieving, which again, we know it's healthy to be able to talk to people. So we sometimes have to help them through this isolation. Some other symptoms, stress, aches and pains. Sometimes people's grieving does turn into real pain for them, physical pain. Can lose their appetite. Again, they can be angry. Fatigue is another one because they're not sleeping well a lot of times, so they're tired. And then guilt. Did they do enough to help the person who was dying or to help the person they've lost? Or if they're the ones that ill, is it their fault because they didn't take care of themselves? And then lastly, the treatments. Very often people use a combination of counseling and medication. Medications can include sedatives, antidepressants, or anti-anxiety. Sometimes the medications can include things to help people sleep. Counseling can help in a number of different ways. Support groups can be important. If someone is terminally ill themselves, they may feel better if they're around people that are going through similar things. Some bereavement groups where somebody's lost a child, somebody's lost a parent, and individual therapy very often plays into this too. And it's important to remember counseling is not a cure for grief. It's just to help people to deal with grief. Grief will probably always be a part of people's lives when they've lost someone important, but over time their grief does change and lessen a little bit.